At the far edge of the Black Hollow Horse Fair, beyond the polished show rings and neatly arranged vendor stalls selling leather goods and braided halters, there stood a rust-bitten wagon hitched to a pair of tired mules. The crowds didn't venture there. Not because of the smell, though the tang of old sweat and cheap tobacco hung thick, but because of the three figures inside the makeshift corral. They were horses, or at least that's what they looked like beneath the burlap sacks tied over their heads with rough, greasy twine. They stood too still, too silent, like statues made of bone and waiting. No one bid, no one asked. Floyd Cutter, the man who brought them, leaned against the corral rail like a man who knew he was already halfway run out of town. He wore a dust-covered duster and a permanent sneer, his boots scuffed, his belt loose. A man who'd once had a name in another place, now scraping by on secrets. His eyes scanned the fair but never lingered long on anything alive. Most vendors and buyers gave him a wide berth. A pair of auction boys tried to wave him off when he first pulled up that morning, but something about the way those horses stood motionless, despite the hammering of hooves all around, kept even the loudest from saying more. Rumors sparked, as they always did. Some whispered the animals were sick with swamp fever. Others said they were wild rescues from a burned-out ranch near the Wyoming line. One child claimed she saw red marks leaking from under one of the sacks. Her mother pulled her away. Only one man watched long enough to notice something different. Gideon Thorne, 48, and shaped like the mountains he'd lived beneath most his life, stood at the edge of the main tent with a hand wrapped around a chipped enamel mug of stale coffee. He wasn't there to buy. Not this year. His ranch, what was left of it, barely scraped through winter, and the barn roof still wore the holes last December's storm had chewed into it. But he came to Black Hollow every season out of habit, out of loyalty to the land and memory. Sometimes that was all a man had left. He hadn't seen the horses at first. It was the color that caught him. A slash of bright red soaking through coarse brown fabric, right at the muzzle of the middle animal. Blood, not old. He stepped closer, slowly, careful not to startle. None of the horses flinched. The wind shifted and he caught something else, an odor that didn't belong. Not rot, not illness, but smoke, the kind that clung to fur after a fire had long since died. "Spooked bad," Cutter muttered when Gideon approached. "Been like that since I pulled him out the ash pile up north." "What happened to their eyes?" Gideon asked. His voice dry. Cutter spat into the dirt, the liquid dark as old tar. "Fire scared him near blind, covers help, calms him." Gideon didn't answer. Instead, he stepped around the corral, his boots silent in the dust. The pinto in the middle shifted slightly, just enough for Gideon to see the faint edge of a white crescent beneath the sack. Something about the curve of its stance, the way its weight settled on its hind legs, struck something deep, like a song half remembered from a life long buried. He turned back to Cutter. "You planning to ride out with them or sell?" Cutter shrugged. "Ain't no one buying. You want 'em, take the lot. 200 flat." 200 was a joke. A price for mules with cracked hooves or colts with ruined lungs. Gideon hesitated, not because of the cost, but because something felt wrong in the marrow of it. Still, he reached for his wallet, thumbing bills one by one. As he paid, a frayed scrap of leather fell from Cutter's pocket, half a stirrup flap, torn, stained, with a half-burned brand still visible. Gideon picked it up. It was the old Thorne mark, Ethan's mark. But by the time he looked up, Cutter was already halfway up the trail, his wagon rattling like bones over stone, never once looking back. Back at the far edge of the fair, under a bruised sky thick with the scent of horse sweat and pine resin, Gideon led the three animals to his trailer. None of them resisted. Not a hoof misplaced, not a twitch of the ear. They walked like they knew the road, like they'd waited for it. He drove home through switchback trails that carved through Bitterroot's southern edge, past the rock-slide scars and fire-burnt valleys where spring green fought its way back every year. The horses stayed silent in the trailer behind him, but Gideon checked the mirror again and again, as if he expected the sacks to move, as if some hidden eye was watching. By the time he backed into the main yard of Thorn Hollow, the sun had dipped low and painted the ridge in copper. He let the horses out one at a time, guiding them into the isolation pen behind the barn. The pinto walked first, slow and deliberate. Then the bay mare. Then the tall black gelding, who paused at the threshold before crossing like a soldier checking a trap. The wind lifted. Somewhere in the trees a bird cried once, then fell silent. Gideon leaned on the post rail, eyes on the burlap sacks that still covered the horses' heads. He could hear their breathing, calm, steady, no trace of panic. That frightened him more than any fever or kick ever could. These weren't rescues, they were survivors, and they weren't waiting to be saved. They were waiting to be seen. The wind that swept through Gideon Thorne's ranch that evening carried more than mountain chill. It carried the breath of something unfinished. He stood outside the isolation paddock as twilight curled around the sloped edges of the valley, watching the three horses stand unnervingly still, their heads still cloaked in coarse burlap. Their shapes, even in shadow, bore a gravity that tugged at memory. He hadn't touched the ropes during daylight. Cutter's parting warning still rang hollow in his ears, but instinct had pressed patience into his hands like a steadying stone. Now, in the quiet of night, he felt ready to see what he'd brought home. The barn light hummed faintly behind him, casting a dim cone over the edge of the paddock. He undid the gate latch and stepped in, the gravel whispering under his boots. The first horse broad-shouldered, flanks marred by dried sweat and filth, stood with a weight-shifted stance that whispered pain. Gideon moved slowly, voice low and even as he reached for the knot. The burlap was stained, darkened at the point where blood had seeped through and dried in harsh ridges. He worked the knot loose with deliberate care, letting the sack fall slowly rather than rip it free. What looked back at him from beneath the cloth was not a mystery. It was a rupture in time. A pinto stallion, aged but proud, lifted his head as the sack fell. One eye, dark as storm-washed bark, the other a milky blue that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. And between them, a deep scar running diagonally from the ear to the soft curve of the muzzle, old but unmistakable. The shape of that face was burned into Gideon's past like a brand on flesh. He staggered backward before he knew his legs had moved, breath catching not from fear, but from recognition. Stormlight. The name rang in his chest before it reached his lips. Stormlight had been Ethan's horse, loyal beyond measure, a colt they'd raised together since his hooves first found earth. The same Stormlight that was presumed dead the night fire took the barn and Ethan with it. Yet here he stood, marked by time but not broken, looking at Gideon as if no years had passed at all. Gideon reached out with a trembling hand, brushing the coarse mane aside to feel the ridge of the scar. Stormlight didn't flinch. If anything, he leaned into the touch, a slow exhale leaving his lungs as if the burden of silence had finally lifted. That moment between man and horse, memory and miracle hung suspended in the crisp night air like a truth finally given shape. But there wasn't time to get lost in grief. The other two horses still waited. The next was a bay mare, smaller but well-muscled beneath months of neglect. The knot holding her sack was tighter, almost surgically bound, and she twitched beneath his hand as he worked it free. When the cloth fell, she blinked under the sudden light but didn't shy away. Her eyes, amber and steady, regarded him with the weary dignity of something long used to pain. Her front legs bore faint rope burns, nearly healed but unmistakable. Around her muzzle, The fur grew thinner in patches, like someone had once tried to disguise her markings. Gideon ran his hand along her neck and paused. Beneath the winter coat, hidden deep under the surface, was the faintest ridge. A brand. Faded, almost invisible, but still there. The black stallion was last. Bigger than the other two by nearly a hand, his breath came in slow, steady clouds, posture locked like a soldier at post. Gideon hesitated before untying him. The air around this one felt heavier somehow, charged. When the sack slipped off, the stallion didn't bolt or rear. He simply blinked once, twice, then turned his head ever so slightly, revealing the unmistakable profile of a battle-hardened thoroughbred. His eyes scanned the perimeter like a sentry, and Gideon swore, just for a moment, that the horse recognized his voice when he muttered the word, "easy." There was discipline in the way he stood, in the way he waited. This wasn't just a stolen workhorse. He'd seen war horses move like this before, back when he wore the badge of a cavalryman and called dusty trails his duty. By the time the sun cracked open the horizon the next morning, Gideon had not slept. The weight of what stood in his paddock pressed on his chest like the memory of smoke. He made 2 calls before coffee. The first was to Celia Whitmore, the only vet in 50 miles who wouldn't ask too many questions before she arrived. The second, he made to himself, an unspoken promise he'd finish what Ethan started. When Celia arrived just before noon, her pickup wheezing up the slope, she brought not just syringes and diagnostic kits, but the kind of quiet steadiness Gideon had always appreciated in her. They didn't talk much as she examined the horses, gloved hands working quickly but tenderly. She scanned the bodies with a handheld wand connected to her old ultrasound tablet. The signal hummed, then beeped. "They've all got subdermal microchips," she said softly. "But these aren't veterinary ones. They're military grade, unregistered and masked. Someone went through a lot of trouble to hide their identities." She peeled back some of the hair above the bay mare's flank, revealing the brand Gideon had found the night before. Her eyes narrowed. "That's been chemically burned out. Professional job." A pause. Then she looked at him and said, with more weight than surprise, "These horses were meant to disappear." Gideon exhaled slowly. Not just disappear. Be forgotten. As she ran further diagnostics, Celia pointed out telltale signs he hadn't seen: laser-sutured scar tissue, injection points consistent with hormone regulation, an unusual molar pattern on the stallion that suggested high-performance genetic breeding. None of it added up to anything good. "These weren't just stolen for resale," she murmured. "Someone used them, trained them, possibly bred them. This isn't just a theft ring, Gideon. It's something bigger, something funded." He felt it in his bones. The return of that night, the flames, the lies told too easily. Stormlight's scar had opened more than just memory. It had torn the veil on a truth long buried, and now that it had surfaced, it would not let him rest. As Celia packed her kit, promising to cross-check the microchip codes with her private database, Gideon stood again before the 3 horses. Stormlight stared back at him, not with fear, but expectation, as if he hadn't just returned to a place of safety, but to the next chapter of something unfinished. The storm rolled in just after dusk, not the kind that brought thunder or lightning, but the kind that crept through the trees like a whisper too old to trace. Gideon stood beneath the overhang of his barn, eyes on the darkening ridge as the first drops of rain pattered softly against the tin roof. Behind him, the 3 horses, Stormlight, the bay mare, and the black stallion, moved in uneasy patterns inside their stalls, as if their bones remembered something the mind had not yet recalled. He hadn't slept much in 2 nights, not since the burlap sacks had come off and the past he thought he buried 12 years ago looked him square in the face through Stormlight's mismatched eyes. That scar-slanted, ragged, healed ugly wasn't just a wound, it was a signature. One he'd last seen beneath the collapsing beams of his brother's barn on the worst night of his life. Gideon stepped inside the smaller side room of the barn where Ethan's old workbench still stood, its drawers swollen from time and weather. Most of Ethan's belongings had been lost to flame, but this section of the barn had survived, barely. It was the only place Gideon had never fully cleaned out, and not for lack of trying. Every time he'd come in here over the years, something in the air stalled him. A smell, a sound, or the way the light landed on an old nail, some reminder that grief still had hands. Tonight, though, he was looking for something. Not memories, not ghosts. Proof. He worked slowly, peeling back wooden panels at the rear of the bench. His fingers felt before his eyes could see, the edge of a charred notebook, wedged between the wall slats, hidden like someone had intended it never to be found. It came free with a faint snap, the edges crisp and blackened, but the center still intact. The leather binding cracked as he opened it. Inside, Ethan's handwriting ran in tight, slanted lines, sharp, efficient, and dated meticulously. Entries from months before the fire detailed concerns Gideon had never heard voiced aloud. Strange cattle sales, ranchers reporting animals missing after seasonal auctions, and one particularly chilling note. Tom Keller called off inspection on the Northfire Ranch blaze burn pattern didn't match lightning. No witnesses. Branded studs disappeared. Nobody asked why. Gideon turned the page with trembling hands, and there it was, the mark. A brand sketch, triangular with a jagged bottom line, like a cracked mountain. It matched the faded shape Celia had uncovered beneath Stormlight's winter coat the night before. Another page named Floyd Cutter in a list of handlers suspected of brokering stolen livestock, his alias, his movement patterns, even a guess at the wagon he used. Rain intensified overhead, masking the thudding of his own heart. Ethan hadn't just suspected a ring of theft. He'd been tracking it, and someone had made sure he wouldn't finish. Gideon closed the journal slowly, like lowering a casket lid. It wasn't just the truth inside that chilled him. It was the implication. The fire that took Ethan, the fire that ended their family line, may have been set on purpose. And if Cutter was still operating, selling war-hardened horses like spoiled meat, then Ethan's death had not been the end of a tragedy. It had been the start of a cover-up. As if summoned by the thought, a crack of wood echoed outside. Gideon spun, tucking the journal under his coat. The horses neighed sharply, hooves clattering inside their stalls. He stepped outside just in time to see Celia's truck screech to a halt at the edge of the pasture. The passenger window was shattered, her headlights flickering dim like a heartbeat stuttering. She stumbled from the driver's side, coat torn, cheeks slick with blood from a gash along her temple. In her hand was a file case empty, its contents long scattered. Her face said it all before she could speak. "They took the records," she gasped, clutching the fender for balance. "Blocked the canyon road just after I left. 3 men didn't say a word. One had a cattle prod etched with the letters KRI. Gideon's blood ran colder than the rain now soaking through his shirt. KRI wasn't just a company, it was a shell entity once tied to private security contracts, now rumored to be running unsanctioned animal training programs across state lines. Ethan had mentioned them once barely, but only in whispered theory. "They knew what I had," Celia continued, eyes wide with clarity that came from pain and fear, "and they wanted to make sure no one else did." Gideon helped her into the barn, hands steady despite the tremor building in his spine. He'd feared this might turn ugly. He hadn't expected it to start bleeding so fast. Stormlight snorted as Celia passed, bumping his muzzle gently against her shoulder, a gesture that might have once meant comfort, now laced with warning. That night, as Celia slept on the hayloft wrapped in a wool blanket, Gideon sat beneath the hanging lantern with the journal open across his lap. He copied what he could: brand marks, names, notes that might disappear if another hand ever reached this paper. Every word Ethan had written, he etched again like a prayer against forgetting. Outside, the rain slowed, then stopped. Mist curled low across the pasture, like the earth itself exhaled secrets. The horses, for once, were quiet, and in that breathless silence Gideon Thorne finally made a vow not just to protect the animals now trusted to him, but to finish what his brother started, no matter where the trail led or what waited at the end of it. Even if it burned again. The wind in Black Hollow shifted just after midnight, brushing the treetops with a chill that didn't belong to early autumn. Gideon Thorne felt it before he heard the soft shuffle of hooves beyond the ridge, before the security lights flickered twice and went out altogether, the kind of stillness that follows too much motion. He was already out of bed, boots laced and rifle slung across his back by the time the first snap of a twig echoed from behind the hay barn. The horses had felt it first. Stormlight's low, guttural snort had rolled through the stable like distant thunder, followed by the nervous stamping of hooves and the rustling of straw as the other two shifted restlessly. Gideon had seen enough in his cavalry days to know the difference between an animal spooked by a coyote and one that smelled men coming under cover of dark. These were men, and they weren't coming to talk. He moved like muscle memory through the barn aisle, brushing Stormlight's mane with one hand to calm the gelding's rigid frame. The scarred pinto's ears were locked forward, muscles coiled tight beneath his aging frame, ready to fight again if asked. The others stood close behind him, quiet, tense, instinctively drawing into his protection. In the distance, a low metallic creak pierced the silence, one of the side gates being jimmied open. Whoever they were, they knew their way around ranches, and they weren't worried about being seen. Gideon flipped the barn latch into place, slid into the shadows near the grain bins, and waited. His breath came slow, purposeful, like it used to before a charge. It wasn't long before shapes began to emerge, 4 figures in dark coats and balaclavas, 2 carrying cattle prods, 1 slinging bolt cutters, another with a device that looked far too military for anything legal. They didn't speak, not even in whispers. They moved with grim efficiency toward the stable doors, but what they hadn't counted on was Stormlight. With a deafening crack, the old pinto launched backward with both hind legs and shattered the fuse box mounted near the barn's corner, killing whatever backup power the intruders thought they had rerouted. Then came the klaxon, an old cavalry bell Gideon had rewired years ago to ring through a series of pulleys tied to the horses' movements. The ranch roared to life and sound. Lights flickered erratically as one of the intruders cursed and yanked a prod high. Gideon stepped out then, rifle raised, not to fire, but to warn. His voice was low and cold. "That's close enough." They didn't listen. The next minute spun out into chaos. One man lunged for the barn, another toward the paddock gate. But they hadn't accounted for the terrain. Celia, awakened by the alarm and armed with nothing more than a flashlight and her grandfather's revolver, appeared at the north fence line and fired once into the air. Enough to scatter, not to kill. The intruders panicked. Not trained men, just hired shadows, and began retreating. One dropped a prod as he tripped over the water trough. Another abandoned a canvas bag filled with nylon rope and labeled tags. By the time silence returned, the ground was scattered with signs of intent: tools for restraint, bolt cutters, a cracked walkie, and a cattle prod etched with 3 ominous letters: K.R.I., Keller Ranching Investments. Celia found Gideon in the barn, tending to Stormlight, whose flanks were damp with sweat but whose gaze remained clear and unfazed. "They wanted them back," she whispered, crouching beside the black stallion who'd wedged himself between the wall and the other 2, ready to defend. "They don't come in small numbers unless they think you'll break easy," Gideon muttered, wrapping a wound on Stormlight's leg he hadn't noticed until now. "And they didn't come to steal. They came to erase." Morning didn't bring calm. It brought the sheriff. Tom Keller arrived just as the sun cracked over the ridge, casting gold over the still rattled ranch. His truck kicked up gravel as it rolled to a halt too casually, like a man coming to check on a friend's fence post. He stepped out with a practiced frown, a clipboard in one hand and badge in full display. But the second Stormlight saw him, something changed. The gelding didn't rear or bolt. He walked, straight toward Kellor. Then he stopped 3 feet away, head low, hooves stiff, gaze unwavering. No snort, no sound, just stillness. Keller's face twitched barely, but it was enough for Gideon to step in between. "Sheriff," Gideon said, voice dry, "you're early." Keller forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you had some trouble last night. Thought I'd check in, see if anything needed reporting." "Not sure what I'd report. 4 shadows in the dark, some busted wire, an old bell that still works. Could be anything." Keller's eyes drifted to the rope burn still visible on Stormlight's legs. "Strange horses you got." "Survivors," Gideon said simply. The silence between them stretched thin. Then Keller nodded, tucked the clipboard away without using it, and tipped his hat with an empty gesture. "If you see anything else, you know where to find me." They watched his truck vanish down the hill. Only then did Celia whisper, "That horse was ready to kill him." "No," Gideon said, placing a hand on Stormlight's neck. He was ready to remember. That night, Gideon didn't sleep. He stayed by the paddock fence, rifle across his knees, watching the horses as the wind picked up again. Stormlight paced the perimeter with precision, flanked once or twice by the black stallion. The mare stood guard closer to the barn, her ears twitching at every rustle. In the quiet, Gideon understood. These weren't just animals who survived something brutal. They were witnesses, carriers of truth no one else had lived to tell. And for that, someone had tried to erase them. But not anymore. He looked out into the dark and spoke low, more to himself than to the night. "They came back for you once. Next time, we'll be ready." Morning light spread across the ridges like a secret being slowly confessed, touching the frost-laced rooftops of Black Hollow and the battered fences of Gideon Thorne's ranch with reluctant gentleness. In the stillness that followed a sleepless night, Gideon stood outside the stable, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath curling into the chilled air like smoke from a fire not yet out. The 3 horses grazed quietly within view, but there was a tension to their movements, a sharpness in their posture that mirrored the tightening knot in Gideon's gut. The evidence was gathered. Celia's photographs of the brand scar buried under Stormlight's coat, the half-burned journal that still bore Ethan's hand, and the strange insignia KRI etched into the stun baton left behind by the intruders. Yet none of it would matter if they couldn't survive long enough to present it. The second attack came just before dawn, unexpected only in its speed. 3 men, dressed in hunting gear and mounted on horses unfamiliar to the area, appeared through the tree line behind the barn. Gideon barely had time to shout before one of them opened fire, sending a bullet splintering through the stable's doorframe. Celia ducked behind the feed barrels as Gideon took cover near the paddock fence. The 3 attackers tried circling the barn, likely intending to drive the horses out and reclaim them, or silence the only witnesses who could prove where they'd come from. The paint horse Stormlight didn't panic. He charged toward the intruder's left flank, hooves pounding like war drums, scattering one of the riders just long enough for Gideon to take his shot. The round struck one of the attackers in the leg, and the man crumpled to the earth, screaming through clenched teeth. Gideon recognized the voice. Sheriff Tom Keller. The other two scrambled. One retreated behind the tree line. The other bolted toward the road, but Stormlight and the Black Stallion boxed him off, forcing him to drop his weapon and run. In the flurry of hoofbeats and shouted curses, Gideon approached the downed sheriff, blood pooling beneath his thigh and rage pouring from his mouth. "I should have burned the whole ridge," Keller hissed. Even as pain knotted his face. But Gideon didn't reply. He simply disarmed him and tossed the weapon into the trough, then tied the sheriff's wrists with a worn lasso that had once belonged to Ethan. By the time the sun was cresting fully over the mountains, the scene was calm again, but the threat had left its mark. This time, there would be no more warnings, no more doubt. Later that afternoon, with Keller groaning under the watch of two neighboring ranchers called in for help, Gideon and Celia presented everything before the Black Hollow Town Council. Every branded scar, every photo, every witness testimony Ira had sent through a signed statement. Most damning of all was a small stitched patch retrieved from Keller's pocket, the same brand used by the illegal breeding syndicate. KRI Keller Ranch Incorporated had never been real land, only a name to wash stolen stock through quiet auctions like the one Gideon had walked into weeks ago. Sheriff Keller didn't speak during the hearing. The wound in his leg had been cleaned, but the silence he wore was that of a man caught too red-handed to feign innocence. His badge was stripped before sunset, and by nightfall the townspeople who had once turned a blind eye to his control whispered with quiet shame outside the general store. 2 weeks later, Cutter was found dead in a shack 3 ridges over, a bullet to the chest and a forged note nearby claiming remorse. But everyone who'd stood before the council knew he hadn't pulled that trigger himself. Dirty men with clean boots had ties to the bloodier layers of that ring, and some truths would stay buried in the bitterroot soil forever. But not all of them. On the morning Gideon opened the gates to Thorn's hollow sanctuary, it wasn't celebration that filled him, but peace. Stormlight stood at the head of the corral, eyes calm, hooves steady, as if he too understood the shift in the air. Behind him, the bay mare and Black Stallion grazed near the fence, unaware of the people gathering at the trail's bend, a handful of kids from the county's shelter program, and a few broken veterans with eyes like Gideon's used to be. Celia, dust on her jeans and a coffee mug in hand, walked up beside him. "Not bad for a man who didn't even want to buy a horse," she said. Gideon didn't answer at first. His gaze had settled on the scar above Stormlight's eye, the same one Ethan had kissed gently when they were boys, when that horse was nothing but a wild thing barely broken in. "He came back for something," Gideon said finally. "Not just the land, not just the past. He came back because someone had to carry what Ethan couldn't." As the wind shifted down from the peaks and the flag above the barn flapped against the morning sun, Gideon knew this was no longer about justice or revenge. It was about restoration, redemption. And some hearts, no matter how long they'd been silenced, knew exactly where to return once the noise of the world fell away.